Welcome back to Echoes of Ihsan. We are going to do a deep dive, into the Witr prayer today and, be guided by Sahih Bukhari, Book 16, which focuses entirely on this prayer. Now, I think even if you're already familiar with Witr, we might find some really fascinating nuances in these hadiths.
Absolutely. The narrations about the Prophet Muhammad's, life and teachings, they provide so much detail. Even on practices we might think we already, know pretty well.
Yeah. Okay, so anyone just joining us for the first time, and a little bit of context. So
Yeah.
Sahih Bukhari is this collection of the Prophet's sayings and actions, and it's considered, one of the most authentic sources in the Islamic tradition. Witr is this special prayer that's traditionally offered as the last prayer of the night. So after the obligatory Isha prayer,
Mm-hmm.
it's a really special time for dedicated personal connection with God.
That's right. And what we're going to see is that even though it's highly recommended, there's actually quite a bit of flexibility in how Witr is performed.
Yeah. Yeah, let's jump right into that with Hadith 105. So here, Ibn Umar, a close companion of the Prophet, tells us that the Prophet said, night prayers are usually prayed in sets of 2 rakas. Just a quick reminder, a raka is like one complete cycle of prayer postures, so things like bowing and prostrating. But then the Hadith says if you're worried about dawn coming, and the time for Fajr, the morning prayer, you can just pray 1 raka to make it Witr.
Interesting. What's interesting here is that it highlights a key principle of Islam, accommodating individual circumstances.
Right.
The goal is to make connecting with God accessible, not burdensome.
Right.
So whether you have time for a lot of rakas or just a few, Witr is still within reach.
Yeah, and even within that, there's room for personal preference. So Ibn Umar, who was known for being incredibly meticulous in following the Prophet's ways, would actually pause between each set of 2 rakas and that final single raka of Witr. Wow. It makes me wonder if this pause, had some kind of spiritual significance for him. Maybe like a moment of reflection or contemplation before going on.
That's a beautiful insight. It speaks to how even within a structured practice, there's space for individual, expression and mindfulness.
Right.
And it reminds us that the companions, though deeply devoted, were also diverse in their approaches to prayer.
Yeah, it's kind of like how we might all read the same book,
Yeah.
but come away with slightly different interpretations or takeaways,
Exactly. And that diversity of understanding, as long as it's rooted in the core principles, is a source of richness, in the Islamic tradition. Now, to get a more concrete picture of how the Prophet himself prayed with the writ, let's look at Hadith 106.
Okay, so this one is narrated by Ibn Abbas. He actually got to spend the night with the Prophet. And he describes how he was sleeping in the same room and woke up in the middle of the night to see the Prophet performing wudu. So the ritual ablution before prayer,
Right.
Ibn Abbas even recounts how meticulously the Prophet washed each part of his body, showing the reverence he brought to even just the smallest actions.
It's such a vivid account. It really gives us a glimpse into the Prophet's personal piety. Yeah.
And it reminds us that he wasn't just delivering teachings, but embodying them in his daily life.
Totally. So then the Prophet stood for prayer, and Ibn Abbas followed suit, praying right beside him.
Wow.
It's such a beautiful scene to imagine, the shared space of devotion.
Yeah.
And then there's this really sweet moment where the Prophet places his hand on Ibn Abbas's head and gently twists his ear, like a gesture of affection and guidance,
Wow.
showing the Prophet's love for his young companion.
It really humanizes the Prophet, doesn't it? We see him not just as a religious leader,
Right.
but as someone who showed kindness and care for those around him.
Absolutely. So then the Prophet prayed 5 sets of 2 rakas and ended with a single raka for winter, giving us a really clear example of that structure we talked about earlier.
And this example carries a lot of weight for Muslims. The Prophet's actions, known as the Sunnah, are considered a model for how we should live our lives, including how we perform our prayers. So we have the flexibility and also a concrete example to follow. This next hadith, though, adds another layer of nuance to the structured discussion.
Yes, Hadith 107 starts by reiterating that structure, praying in sets of 2. And if you want to finish, you pray 1 raka for Witr, but then it brings in a comment from Al-Qasim, a scholar from the generation after the Prophet's companions.
Right. Al-Qasim says that some people would pray 3 rakas for Witr all at once, not in sets of 2. And what's interesting is that he doesn't condemn this. He says it's considered permissible.
This points to an important concept in Islamic jurisprudence.
Okay.
The idea that there can be varying opinions among scholars on certain details of practice, as long as these opinions are based on sound reasoning and don't contradict the fundamental principles of the Quran and Sunnah, they are seen as valid.
It's a reminder that Islam isn't meant to be rigid or monolithic. There's room for different interpretations and approaches,
Mm-hmm.
which I think makes it more adaptable to different cultures and contexts.
Exactly. And this concept of flexibility within a framework is something we see throughout these hadiths on Witr. What about Hadith 108? This one gives us a glimpse into the Prophet's longer night prayers.
Yes. It's narrated by Aisha, the Prophet's wife,
Mm-hmm.
and she mentions that he would sometimes pray 11 rakas in total at night. And she even describes the length of his prostrations, saying they were so long it was like he was reciting 50 verses of the Quran.
Wow. That image really conveys the depth of his devotion, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And this connects to the idea of supererogatory prayers known as nawfal.
Okay.
These are prayers that go above and beyond the obligatory ones, and they're a way to further strengthen one's connection with God.
It's like the Prophet is showing us that while the basic structure is important, it's that heartfelt connection that truly matters. And speaking of finding that connection, I'm curious about the timing of Witr.
Mm-hmm.
Did the Prophet always pray it at the same time each night?
That's where Hadith 110 comes in. This hadith tells us that no, the Prophet actually varied the timing of his Witr prayer. Some nights he prayed it earlier, some nights later, depending on the circumstances.
This is really helpful because I think sometimes we get caught up in feeling like we have to do things at a specific time to be correct.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be an obstacle to actually praying.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What's important is the consistency and sincerity of the practice, not necessarily adhering to a rigid timetable. And remember, the Prophet was also a leader, a husband, a father. He had a lot of responsibilities.
Right.
So his example shows us that it's okay to adapt our spiritual practices to fit our lives as long as we're making the effort.
So we've seen there's flexibility in the structure, the number of rakas, even the timing.
Yeah.
But there's one hadith that really surprised me, Hadith 113.
Yeah.
This one talks about the Prophet praying Witr while riding a camel.
Yes. This hadith really emphasizes that Islam prioritizes accessibility and practicality in worship. Even in the midst of travel, when things are uncertain and routines are disrupted, the Prophet maintained his connection with God through prayer.
It's like he's saying no excuses,
Yeah.
but in a really encouraging way, not a guilt-tripping way.
Right.
There's always a way to make time for prayer no matter where you are or what your circumstances are. Now, before we move on, there's one specific aspect of the Witr prayer that I'd love to get your insights on. The Qanut.
Of course. The Qanut is a supplication,
Okay.
a special prayer of invocation that's recited during prayer. And there are differing opinions among scholars about whether it's an essential part of the Witr prayer or a separate act of devotion that can be done at other times as well.
Oh.
Some scholars believe it should be included in every Witr prayer, while others consider it more situational, especially during times of hardship or when seeking God's protection.
And we see an example of that situational use in Hadith 116. This one tells the story of how the Prophet recited Qanut after bowing in the Witr prayer for an entire month.
Mm-hmm.
He was seeking God's punishment on certain tribes who had broken a peace treaty and killed a group of Muslims who were memorizing the Quran.
This story adds another dimension to our understanding of Qanut.
Yeah.
It shows us that it's not just about personal pleas, but can also be a way to address injustice and seek divine intervention in matters that affect the community.
It's a powerful reminder that prayer isn't just about personal piety, but can also be a means of engaging with the world around us and seeking God's guidance in navigating its complexities.
And I think that's a great segue into the next part of our discussion, where we'll explore some more of the spiritual and practical implications of these hadiths on Witr. You know, it's fascinating how these hadiths on the Witr prayer reveal its, multifaceted nature. It's not just like a set of instructions, but a practice that combines structure and flexibility, practicality and spirituality. It's something you can personalize while connecting to a tradition that spans centuries.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. We've seen how it can be adapted to different circumstances, opinions, even prayed while traveling. But there's one hadith I want to touch on before we go too far. Number 112, the Prophet encouraged Muslims to make Witr their last prayer at night.
Yes, that's a really significant detail.
Yeah.
It suggests that Witr isn't just any extra prayer, but a kind of seal on our nightly devotions.
Yeah.
A final act of surrender and seeking peace before sleep.
It's beautiful imagery, isn't it? Like closing the chapter on the day's efforts and anxieties, turning to God one last time before resting. And as we've been discussing these hadiths, I think what stands out to me is this emphasis on balance and moderation in Islam.
I completely agree. It's woven into the very fabric of Witr, the
Yeah.
flexibility of its structure, the allowance for different scholarly views, even the prophet himself, adjusting the timing based on his needs. It's a faith that seeks to make worship sustainable, not a source of stress or rigidity.
And that's so important in today's world when you say people are overwhelmed, pressured to meet these impossible standards.
Mm-hmm.
But Islam offers this path of ease, recognizing that we're all on unique journeys with varying capacities.
Precisely. It's about finding a rhythm that works for you. While remaining true to the core tenets of the faith, I think this is one of the reasons Islam has resonated across cultures and generations.
Right.
It doesn't demand we fit a single mold.
Speaking of molds, it's fascinating that even the Prophet's companions, those closest to him, had subtle differences in how they prayed Witr. Makes me wonder, how can we as Muslims today navigate those differences while still preserving the spirit of the prayer?
That's a question worth pondering deeply.
Yeah.
It calls for, thoughtful dialogue, seeking knowledge from reliable sources, and cultivating humility. We can't just assume our way is the only way,
Right.
but engage with our diverse tradition respectfully.
It's almost like each generation adds its own layer of understanding to these practices. We're building on the foundations laid by those who came before us. Now, as we approach the final reflections on our Witr deep dive, what key insights stand out to you? What should our listener really take to heart?
For me, it's that multifaceted nature of the prayer we keep coming back to. It's deceptively simple on the surface, but contains layers of meaning. Accessibility. God is always within reach, whether you pray 2 rocks or 10, whether you're home or on a journey.
Right.
Sincerity over strictness. It's not about robotic adherence to rules, but about cultivating a genuine connection through prayer, no matter your energy level or time constraints. Respectful disagreement. It's okay for scholars and individuals to have differing views on the finer details as long as it's rooted in respect for the foundational texts.
Beautifully summarized. And I think this ties into a bigger lesson about Islam as a whole. It's a faith that encourages us to use our intellect to ask questions, to engage with its teachings critically.
Exactly. Blind faith isn't the goal.
Right.
It's about understanding why we do what we do and how to apply these principles in our lives in a meaningful way.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to pose a final thought-provoking question to our listener.
Yeah.
We've seen how the Prophet's companions had slight variations in their Witr practice, even though they learned directly from him. So this begs the question, how can we as Muslims today approach these differences with wisdom and compassion? How can we find unity amidst that diversity while still holding true to the core of our faith?
That's a challenge for every generation, isn't it? To balance respecting the tradition with recognizing that our understanding evolves over time.
Right.
It requires open hearts, open minds, and a willingness to learn from one another.
Beautifully put. It's a reminder that the journey of understanding and practicing Islam is ongoing. It's not about reaching a fixed destination, but about constantly striving, reflecting, and seeking deeper meaning.
And I believe the Witr prayer, with all its nuances and flexibility, is a perfect microcosm of that journey. It teaches us to be mindful, adaptable, and always seeking closeness to the divine, even amidst life's complexities.
Well said. Before we conclude, I want to remind our listener that we've only scratched the surface of this topic. There's so much more to explore within these hadiths and within the broader Islamic tradition. So don't be afraid to delve deeper into the full narrations. Have conversations with knowledgeable people in your community, and most importantly, apply what you learn to your own practice.
Absolutely. The beauty of faith lies not just in understanding, but in embodying its teachings. So let this deep dive be a catalyst for a more mindful and fulfilling spiritual journey.
It's really interesting when we think about Witr in this way. It's not just about going through the motions. It's about understanding, the heart and the flexibility and how it really reflects, the principles of Islam.
Yeah. It really is a beautiful reflection of the faith, isn't it? Adaptable but grounded, encouraging that personal connection, but still part of a shared heritage.
Right. And, for anyone who's listening and maybe feeling a little bit overwhelmed, like, wow, there's a lot to Witr, I just want to say, don't worry, start small.
Yeah.
Even if you're new to, night prayers or even prayer in general.
Yeah, that's great advice. Consistency over intensity, as they say. Even just a few rakas, offered with presence and with intention are much more meaningful than, long sporadic prayers when you're not fully present.
That's like any habit, right?
Exactly.
Small, sustainable steps lead to long-term change. And with prayer, that change is about nurturing a connection with God, weaving it into your daily life.
And remember, you're not alone on this path. The Muslim community is there, to support you and guide you. So don't be afraid to reach out to, scholars or other people in your community if you have questions.
Yeah, there's so much wisdom and lived experience,
Yeah.
It's just waiting to be shared. And it reminds us that we're all on this journey together.
Yeah, exactly. We
Yeah.
learn from each other, we uplift each other, and we strive, together towards a deeper understanding and practice.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Witr, I hope you leave not just with, insights about the prayer itself,
Mm-hmm.
but like a renewed appreciation for the beauty and the depth of Islam.
I hope so. May your exploration of Witr and of, faith more generally lead to, greater peace and meaning and connection.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Echoes of Ihsan. Until next time, may peace be upon you.